The crystal chandeliers inside Il Toro Nero cast a soft amber glow over the immaculate white tablecloths, their light shimmering against the meticulously polished, handcrafted crystal glasses. Madeline Cross balanced 4 plates along her slender arms as she moved gracefully between the tables. It had been 3 months since she stepped into what was known as the most expensive Italian restaurant in all of Tribeca, and she had already mastered the art of becoming an invisible server. Eyes lowered, a polite smile, ears pretending not to hear. Especially on the nights when Table 7 had guests, Maddie had learned to recognize them within seconds from the moment they crossed the carved oak doors. Men in tailored Italian suits worth more than several months of rent, moving like silent predators, and the women beside them glittering with jewelry that could have paid for 4 years of Maddie's college tuition back when she still had an ordinary life, back before she carried the burden of investigating the most dangerous criminal network in New York. Table 7 was always reserved for Dominic Rizzo, a man who, according to the FBI files, owned 3 golf courses, 2 Italian wine import companies, a chain of boutique hotels, and a quiet network of connections stretching through the city council, the judges' chambers, and more than a few police officers. But no file could convey what Maddie felt now: the steel-cold presence, the dark eyes like a bottomless abyss, and that half-smile capable of being seductive and threatening at the same time. Tonight, Dominic sat in his usual place near the large window overlooking Franklin Street, accompanied by 3 men she had never seen before. One of them, around 40 with graying hair and a heavy Italian accent, poured himself a glass of wine and let out a mocking laugh. He looked at her as if she were a moving piece of furniture. Then he said, in Italian, "American women, pretty faces and empty heads. She probably thinks we are talking about the weather." A single second of silence froze every sound in the room. She was not supposed to react. She had been trained. But something in that comment, the contempt, the arrogance, made Maddie straighten her back. She was about to set the tray down and walk away. But then she heard the 2 words that stopped her heart. Federal judge. The phrase slammed into her chest, pulling her out of the trained agent's skin and throwing her back 6 years to a hospital room, the smell of smoke and antiseptic, her father's face wrapped in bandages. Her training screamed, "Silence! Record! Report!" But the daughter inside her, the one who watched her father's life shatter over those very words, took over. She set the tray down, and for the first time looked directly into the eyes of Dominic Rizzo. "Gentlemen," she said in fluent Italian, her voice sharp as a blade even as her pulse hammered, "if you are finished discussing the empty-headed waitresses, perhaps you would prefer to talk about something more interesting, like the federal judge you are planning to assassinate this Thursday evening." The entire restaurant fell silent, as if everyone had just heard a clock stop ticking. Stunned eyes turned toward her, but Maddie only looked at Dominic. His gaze did not leave her for even a heartbeat, as if analyzing every line of her face. In that moment, Maddie knew she had crossed too far. She should have listened, observed, memorized, and slipped away like a shadow. But hearing those specific words had triggered not just pride or anger, but the deep, unhealed trauma she had buried beneath her quiet disguise. If you are listening to this part, you can already sense the moment Maddie stepped across a dangerous line, where every word could change her fate, and every step pulled her further into Dominic Rizzo's world. Before we continue this tense journey, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like, and share so you do not miss the gripping and captivating stories we bring every day. And tell us where you are listening from. Leave a comment with your city or country below. Every comment helps us understand how far this story has reached and how many hearts it has touched among lovers of dramatic mafia romance tales like this. Dominic said nothing. He only lifted his glass, took a small sip, his eyes never leaving her face. Then he set the glass down, tapping his finger lightly against the marble surface. A signal. A man behind her, the security guard she knew as Luca, stepped forward and whispered in her ear, "Mr. Rizzo wants to see you in the private room upstairs, right now." She nodded slightly, gripping her apron to steady herself. No one stopped her, but the eyes from table 7 felt like icy blades pressing into her back as she walked out of the dining room. The hallway leading to the second floor was lined with deep reddish-brown carpet, the wall sconces casting warm light onto oil paintings of the Italian coastline. Maddie walked slowly, feeling each heartbeat pounding like a warning drum. When the door to the private room opened, Dominic was already seated in a dark brown leather armchair. Behind him, a walnut cabinet filled with vintage Italian wines. On the table sat a glass of untouched whiskey. No one else was there. The door closed behind her softly but with an echo that filled the room. Dominic looked at her as though studying a map he had never seen before. There was no anger, no haste, only a frightening calm that felt more dangerous than any outburst could be. "Your name," he said, voice low and deliberate, each word striking the air, "is not Maria, like it says in the employee file. You speak Italian like someone raised in Bologna, and you know about an assassination that has never been made public." Maddie stayed composed, her eyes steady. "I had family in law. I heard too many of your names at dinner tables." Dominic lifted an eyebrow, amused as if listening to a charming fable. "So what are you? A cop? A journalist?" Maddie pressed her lips together, thinking through a few tense seconds. "Tell the truth. Impossible. Keep pretending to be a clueless waitress. She would lose her chance to get closer." She chose the middle path. "I used to be a law student. My father is a federal judge. He was threatened 3 years ago. Since then, I lost my faith in justice." She was not completely lying, only omitting several details. Dominic did not speak, but something shifted in his eyes. Not trust, but consideration. He stood up and walked toward her slowly. She did not step back, even though her spine tightened. When he stopped just half a meter from her, he tilted his head slightly as if listening to the rhythm of her heartbeat through her breath. "What do you want?" Maddie answered immediately without hesitation. "The truth. And a chance." Dominic let out a quiet laugh, a sound without joy. He stepped back, walked to the wine cabinet, and poured himself another glass. "You are reckless. I like the reckless ones." He looked at her again, his stare losing a hint of its sharpness. "I will keep you here, but if you lie to me again, you will never walk out of this place." Maddie nodded. She knew this was the turning point. There was no return. Dominic raised his glass as if in a toast. "Welcome to the Rizzo Group, law student." When the door closed behind her, Maddie leaned gently against the hallway wall and drew in a deep breath, trying to steady the trembling in her knees. Dominic's warning still echoed in her mind like a suspended verdict. If she lied one more time, there was no room for error now, no time left for panic. Yet her thoughts, instead of calculating her next step, were pulled backward to a bleak winter morning 6 years earlier, when everything had first begun to fracture. She had been 22 then, preparing for her final exams in her last year of law school at Fordham, and her father, Walter Cross, a respected federal judge, known for his uncompromising stance against organized crime, had been the moral compass she admired, the man who instilled in her the ideals of justice, law, and courage. Their family dinners had always carried the scent of grilled meat, the gentle hum of jazz, and conversations about the Constitution, case law, and the worth of human integrity. Until the day their Upper West Side apartment exploded. Police called it a gas leak, but Maddie knew it was a carefully constructed lie meant to distract the public. Her father survived by little more than a breath and was immediately placed into the Federal Witness Protection Program. He had to vanish, severing all ties to her and her mother, changing his name, his face, his entire life. Maddie learned he was still alive only through a postcard with no return address sent from Montana, containing a single handwritten line: "Do not trust anyone. Not even the FBI is clean." From that moment, something inside Maddie shifted. She abandoned her path toward becoming a lawyer and enrolled instead in the federal agent training program with one purpose alone: to uncover the truth behind that failed assassination and why a man like her father had been betrayed by the very system he served. Over the next 3 years, she endured endless training, working like a shadow in anti-money laundering operations, tailing underground networks, and eventually earning a place in a special intelligence unit dedicated to investigating links between wealthy power brokers and high-level criminal organizations. Every lead pointed to the same name: Dominic Rizzo. He was the final link in a power chain both intricate and contradictory. On the surface, he donated millions to charities, built nursing homes, and funded scholarships for immigrant children. But beneath that polished facade were internal purges, transnational laundering operations, and deaths with no explanations. Maddie cared little for the files. She cared about one single thing: whether the night her father nearly died had any connection to Rizzo. And if it did, she would be the one to end it. She had waited 6 years for the moment she could stand face to face with him. She had not expected it to come so soon, not during a raid or a covert mission, but in a leather-clad room filled with Italian wine and a threat spoken in a low, cold voice. Now, standing here in the heart of his restaurant, Maddie knew she had stepped into a den with no clear exit, but she also knew this might be the place where she would finally uncover the truth. She adjusted her apron, drew another steady breath, and walked down the stairs back to the main dining hall, where suspicious eyes were already waiting. The game had begun, and this time, Maddie would not blink. When Maddie returned to the main dining hall, the atmosphere had settled into an almost suspicious sense of normalcy. Music still floated softly from the ceiling speakers. Guests continued their gentle hum of conversation, and silverware still tapped against porcelain plates with familiar rhythm, but she could feel the shift in the eyes of the staff around her. Some avoided looking at her altogether, while others tracked each of her steps with quick, darting glances, as though she now carried a stain no one could wash off. Maddie lowered her gaze and carried on with the rest of her shift as if nothing had happened. She kept her polite smile, delivered dishes to the right tables, accepted thank yous, and moved on without missing a beat. But inside, she was waiting. A call, a signal, a reaction. Yet no one touched her, no one questioned her, for the next 2 hours. When the wall clock reached 10:30 in the evening, Luca appeared again, this time standing at the entrance of the hallway leading toward the kitchen. He motioned for her without saying a word. Maddie removed her apron, washed her hands, smoothed her hair, and followed him through the back door of the restaurant where a black SUV was already waiting. No one told her where they were going. No one asked whether she wanted to go. She understood that if she refused, the game would end here, and not in a way she could control. The vehicle carried them through the empty streets of Lower Manhattan, merging onto the FDR highway, before heading east. Inside the car, no one spoke. Luca sat in the front. The driver kept his eyes fixed ahead, and Maddie remained in the back with her pulse pounding like a war drum. She did not ask questions, did not resist, and did not look at her phone. When the SUV turned onto a private road, leading to a secluded European-style mansion, perched on a stretch of land overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, Maddie had only one thought. This time, she could not afford another mistake. Dominic was waiting for her inside a softly lit room, warmed by a single amber table lamp, its walls lined with books and a tall window opening onto a wind-swept balcony. He stood with his back to her, staring out toward the sea, a glass of red wine in his hand. When she entered, he did not turn immediately. Only when the door closed behind her did he speak. His voice remained low and slow, but lacked the icy edge it had held before. "Do you know why I have not had anyone remove you?" Maddie stood still, her hands resting at her sides, her eyes following the tall silhouette framed against the dark horizon. "Because you want to know who I really am?" Dominic turned, and his gaze held not just suspicion but a blend of curiosity and something that felt almost like a challenge. "You are reckless. You are clever. But cleverness can be a double-edged blade, especially in my world." Maddie kept her voice even. "I am not here to cause harm. I just want to work. Quietly. Observe. If anything about me makes you uneasy, I can leave immediately." Dominic walked toward her, still holding the wine glass. "If I wanted you gone, you would not be standing here." He set the glass on the oak table and leaned against it, arms folding across his chest. "I have a position open on the internal management team, not serving tables. A job that requires discretion, loyalty, and intellect. I believe you have all three, but I will not ask twice." Maddie did not answer right away. Her mind ran through every possible risk, advantage, and the information she might access if she moved deeper into his world. She knew every step she took was being measured down to the smallest fraction. Finally, she nodded. "I accept." Dominic returned the nod. No smile, no gesture of approval, just a simple inclination of his head like a sentence quietly delivered. "Good. Tomorrow morning at 8, a car will pick you up. Bring your belongings. You will work at the Montauk estate." He turned away again, looking out toward the ocean as though their conversation had been nothing more than a small pause in the middle of larger plans waiting beyond the night. And Maddie, as she walked out of that room, understood that she had stepped yet another level deeper into Dominic Rizzo's world. There was no turning back now, no retreat, and no permission left for mistakes. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the black SUV pulled up in front of the small Brooklyn apartment where Maddie had been staying, though she had been ready since 6, having barely slept, lying awake beneath the dim ceiling light and counting each slow beat of time as it passed. Stepping out the door with a small suitcase and 3 folders hidden deep at the bottom of her bag, she understood she was crossing into a deeper layer of the mission. The kind of threshold where everything could vanish if she failed to control the rhythm of the game Dominic had silently invited her into. The drive to Montauk took more than 2 hours, weaving through mist-covered coastal roads and endless stretches of pine forest, until the Rizzo estate emerged at the horizon, a white wooden fortress in the classic New England style, surrounded by wrought iron fencing and an airtight security perimeter. As the gates opened automatically and the vehicle rolled inside, a tightness pressed against her chest. Not fear, but the acute awareness that from this point on, every breath she took would be recorded somewhere. Luca waited at the top of the steps with an iPad in hand and gave her a new ID card bearing her photo and the alias Isabel Torre, a new identity, a new biography, a new role. Maddie was now Dominic Rizzo's new executive assistant, tasked with managing his schedule, documents, and the coordination of private meetings within the estate, and every detail had already been arranged as though her arrival had been anticipated long before. She asked nothing. She simply followed Luca inside. The interior of the house was not the ostentatious luxury she had expected, but a deliberate, restrained elegance. Every object, expensive, yet perfectly placed. No clutter, white walls, oak floors, wide glass doors opening toward a backyard with a long pool and manicured lawn. Dominic appeared at noon, offered no greeting, handed her a thick file, and said only, "Read this today. You start tomorrow," before disappearing into his upstairs office where no one entered except Luca. Maddie sat alone in the reading room, turning each page: contracts, organizational charts, encrypted contact lists, investment trails so meticulously disguised they made her skin tighten with unease. Dominic was not just a crime boss, he was a financial architect, a strategist who knew how to launder wrongdoing through laws, paperwork, and banks, and the more she read, the more she realized the danger did not lie in guns but in the quiet weight of typed lines. By evening, she was shown to a private bedroom on the 3rd floor overlooking the ocean, a room with no cameras and no microphones, though she knew in a house like this privacy was only an illusion crafted with care. The next 3 days passed in a suffocating rhythm, each morning bringing Dominic's schedule, each hour filled with notations, filtered calls, document checks, encrypted emails. He never asked about her past, and never allowed her to interact with others freely. The staff worked in near silence and seldom spoke more than 3 words at a time. Yet she felt Luca's presence constantly, even when he was nowhere in sight, and she understood that Dominic's coldness was not distance but examination, a truth reflected in the brief glances he gave her whenever he crossed her path in a corridor or meeting room. Eyes dark and undecipherable, holding a quiet test inside, each look as though waiting for the smallest fracture that would make everything collapse. On the 4th night, as Maddie finished organizing a stack of documents in the auxiliary office, Dominic walked in without warning and placed another file on the desk, then fixed his gaze on her. Inside is information about an investment fund in Panama. "Do you see anything concerning?" Maddie recognized the challenge immediately. She scanned the pages, stopping at a small note near the bottom, a suspicious transaction connected to a shell corporation previously investigated by her own bureau. She set the file down and met his eyes. "This one should be reviewed. It does not align with the legal income sources listed above." Dominic remained silent for a few seconds, then nodded once. "Good." He turned away, but this time, when he left the room, he did not close the door behind him, and Maddie understood that in that small gesture she had stepped one layer deeper into the fragile inner circle of Dominic Rizzo's trust, even as she also understood that from now on any mistake she made would not be treated as an accident, but a sentence. At dawn the next morning, Maddie woke before the first line of light touched the horizon. The sea outside lay in a muted gray, and the wind pressed cold currents against the thick glass panes. She sat before the mirror, brushing her hair slowly, her eyes fixed on the reflection staring back. It was still her face, yet now it belonged to Isabel Torre, the discreet executive assistant of Dominic Rizzo, the woman who lived inside a Montauk estate, wrapped in quiet luxury and guarded by layers of encrypted documents. She was no longer the girl wearing an apron at Il Toro Nero, nor the law student who once believed in absolute justice. But beneath that newly carved exterior lived Agent Maddie Cross, quietly memorizing every detail, every appointment, every face that entered or exited the house, so she could transmit it all back to headquarters through the microwave signals hidden inside a simple fountain pen. The double life began swallowing her slowly, steadily. By day, she was Dominic's right hand, arranging investor meetings, noting requests from demanding VIPs, reworking tangled documents drafted by the legal team. By night, she became the unseen observer, opening her encrypted laptop in silence to send reports to her superiors, the last fragile thread tying her to her old world. But the part that surprised her most was not the pressure of the work. It was Dominic himself. He was unlike any case file she had ever studied, unlike the cold-blooded figure described in reports, and unlike the polished businessman he appeared to be. He spoke little, yet every word he uttered carried weight. He did not anger easily, and when he did, he needed no raised voice. He did not pretend closeness, yet he remembered the smallest details, the fact that she preferred her coffee black without sugar, or that she liked to stand by the window each morning to look out at the sea before beginning the day. That quiet precision made Maddie feel as though the observation went both ways, and that sense alone forced her to maintain a careful distance. One afternoon, Dominic asked her to accompany him to East Hampton to meet an investment partner. The meeting took place in a peaceful lakeside home, just the three of them. Maddie sat quietly taking notes, but she sensed the air in the room was far more than financial negotiation. Every sentence Dominic spoke carried a second meaning, and the investor's eyes kept drifting toward her, evaluating her place within this silent hierarchy. On the drive back, the road winding beside the shoreline, Dominic asked suddenly, "If you had to choose between loyalty to an organization or to a person, which would you choose?" Maddie turned to look at him, masking the tension beneath her calm expression. "I think true loyalty is not about where you belong, but about the reason you stay." Dominic said nothing, only nodded while keeping his gaze fixed on the long ribbon of road ahead, but she knew her answer had etched itself somewhere in his mind. In the days that followed, he began allowing her into more internal meetings, even granting her level 2 access to financial documents, a privilege once limited to Luca and one senior manager. She understood this was a sign of trust, but equally a new layer of examination. A single misstep now would offer no margin for redemption. Yet amid the layers of codes, the closed-door meetings, and the dense silence that clung to the estate, what Maddie did not expect was the emotion that followed her back to her room each night. It was not pressure, but a quiet, disorienting conflict. She did not know when it began, but the sound of Dominic's breath during their close working hours started to distract her, and the moment he handed her a cup of ginger tea when she coughed during a meeting sent her heartbeat stumbling. Between the two selves she carried, one real and one constructed, Maddie started to wonder which one was the mask and which one was her true face, and whether she would remain clear-headed enough to finish this mission when her own heart was beginning to slip from the path she had sworn to follow. Late on the 8th day, Maddie was assigned to meet a new partner at an abandoned warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. It was the first time she had been allowed to go alone, without Luca or any security escort shadowing her every move. Dominic handed her a thin folder with no instructions, only a brief, searching look, as if he wanted to see how she would react when pushed beyond the borders of safety. She accepted the task with a calm she wasn't entirely sure was genuine. When the car stopped in front of the old warehouse, Maddie stepped out and glanced around. Not a soul in sight. The sky was dimming, and the ocean wind carried the metallic scent of rust and dust. She pulled open the heavy metal door, its hinges screeching, and stepped inside. Light filtered through shattered windows high in the rafters, casting pale streaks across the oil-stained concrete floor. Exactly 8 minutes later, while she was still checking the folder and preparing to call the office to confirm the meeting, 3 men emerged from the shadows at the far end of the warehouse. One locked the door behind them, and the other 2 advanced toward her. None of them matched the description of the investment partner. One did not need to be a seasoned agent to recognize the trap she had walked into. "You're a bit early," one of them said, his voice half laugh, half threat. "We were still debating what to start with first, that file or that sharp little mouth of yours." Maddie stepped back, her hand tightening around the phone in her coat pocket, thumb searching for the emergency alert button. She did not reach it in time. One of the men lunged, snatching her bag and throwing it to the floor. She spun to run, but her back slammed against the cold steel of a container behind her. The smell of metal, the weight of fear, and the unmistakable stench of betrayal thickened the air. When a rough hand yanked her jacket, time seemed to hiccup. A gunshot cracked through the warehouse, then a second, then a third. Maddie fell, instinctively rolling to the side as she forced her eyes open. One of the men was on the ground, a pool of blood widening beneath his head. The other 2 bolted for the door, but before they reached it, a dark figure stepped out from the narrow corridor behind them. Dominic. He wore a heavy coat, his face utterly unchanged, the Glock in his hand looking as natural as a limb he had been born with. Without the slightest hesitation, he fired 2 more shots, hitting both fleeing men in the legs. They collapsed, screaming in pain, unable to move. Dominic walked toward Maddie, his eyes sweeping over her as though checking for wounds. "Are you hurt?" His voice remained steady, but the flicker of anger mixed with worry in his eyes was impossible to miss. Maddie nodded, though her hands still trembled. "They weren't the ones I was supposed to meet." Dominic's brow tightened, and he signaled to someone emerging behind him, Luca, followed by 2 fully armed men. "Clean it up. Leave nothing behind." Then he turned back to Maddie, bending to pick up her bag before handing it to her. "Next time, if you aren't certain, do not step inside before I confirm it." For the first time, Maddie saw a version of Dominic unshielded by his cold facade. His gaze was still sharp, but behind it was a form of protection that required no explanation. On the drive back, neither of them spoke. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands still trembling slightly, but her heart no longer raced from fear. It raced from something deeper, harder to name. Dominic never looked at her, his attention fixed on the long stretch of road ahead, but she could feel that something between them had shifted. Trust, a fragile thing more delicate than any vow, had begun to take shape in the moment he pulled the trigger for her. That night, when they returned to the estate, Dominic did not walk away immediately as he usually did. He paused at her door, hands in his pockets, his gaze lingering just a fraction longer than it should. "You did well. But never risk yourself alone again. Not in this world." Maddie looked at him and simply nodded. There was nothing else to say. When he turned and walked away, she stood motionless, watching the retreating line of his shoulders. In that moment, she realized she was no longer just being tested by Dominic, she was beginning to test her own heart. And that frightened her more than any ambush ever could. A sudden rainstorm swept in just before midnight, pounding against the earth as though the sky had decided to empty everything it had held back through days of brittle sunlight. Maddie stood in the estate's kitchen, a warm porcelain cup cradled between her palms, her eyes fixed on the backyard where the raindrops struck the ground with the heavy rhythm of an anxious heart. Sleep would not come. Ever since the ambush in Red Hook, her mind had refused to settle. It was not only the gunshots, not only the blood spreading across cold concrete, it was the look in Dominic's eyes when he lifted her from the floor. A look that held more than protection, something deeper, quieter, as though he had seen a truth inside her she herself had not yet dared to name. The wind curled through the open corridor, carrying the scent of salt and wet grass. Maddie set the cup down and stepped out to the back terrace without a coat. The rain touched her hair, her neck, her skin like a cool balm, easing the storm swirling inside her. She stood beneath the eaves, closing her eyes as droplets fell onto her face, each drop feeling like it was trying to wash away the lies, the doubt, the fear. Footsteps sounded behind her. She did not need to turn to know who had come. Dominic stopped beside her, saying nothing at first. The rain poured on, yet the silence between them no longer felt like distance but like an unspoken thread binding them in the dim night. "Do you always come outside when it rains?" Dominic asked, his low voice blending with the wind. Maddie let out a faint, breathy laugh without opening her eyes. "No, but tonight I needed it." He did not ask why. Perhaps he already knew. After a moment he shrugged off his coat and draped it across her shoulders. She opened her eyes and turned toward him, his face softened by rain and the warm light spilling from the window behind them. "Thank you for saving me," she said for the first time since that night. Dominic did not answer immediately. His gaze lingered at the corner of her mouth before drifting up to her eyes, deep and direct in a way that made her unable to look away. "I don't let my people get hurt," he said quietly. She did not know which part of that sentence mattered more, the word people in the context of his organization, or the implication her heart dared to hear. The rain shifted, blowing harder, a few cold drops slipping past the edge of the roof to land on their hair, their cheeks. Dominic stepped closer until she could feel his breath warm against the chill of the night. "But you," he murmured, his eyes locked to hers, "you are not like the others." Maddie swallowed, not from fear, but from the way something inside her trembled at his closeness. "And you," she whispered back, her voice barely above a breath, "you are not like anyone I have ever met." Whatever distance remained between them dissolved when Dominic lifted his hand to her cheek, his thumb brushing away a raindrop sliding down her jaw. Maddie did not know who leaned in first, who closed the final inch between them. She only knew their lips found each other in a moment that felt almost unintentional, like something inevitable, quietly unfolding. The kiss was not hurried, not fierce, but slow and searching, filled with hesitation, as though both feared the fragile moment might disappear if they moved too fast. Maddie felt Dominic's heartbeat against her chest as he drew her closer, his hand steady and tender at the back of her neck, his lips warm enough to melt the cold of the night. When they finally parted, she kept her eyes closed a second longer, holding on to the last echo of the kiss before reason returned. Dominic said nothing. He watched her in silence, then gave a faint, solemn nod, a promise without words. She did not ask what it meant. She only knew that from that moment on, the boundary between performance and truth had been erased, and she was no longer certain whether she was still playing a role or living honestly for the first time in years. At dawn the next morning, Maddie woke earlier than usual despite having slept very little. The rain had passed, but its damp echo still lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of sea salt and the faint aroma of coffee drifting up from downstairs. She sat by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked lawn where the marks from last night's storm still clung to the stone path. The scene was so peaceful it almost made her believe nothing had happened, that the kiss beneath the rain was only a dream she had conjured to escape the weight of reality. But it had not been a dream. She could still feel the clarity of Dominic's eyes when they parted, the warmth of his hand at her back, the quiet nod that felt like a promise spoken without sound. And it was that very truth that unsettled her. For the first time since accepting the mission, Maddie could not distinguish where her role ended and where her real self began. From the moment she stepped into the Montauk estate, her objective had been sharply defined: get close to Dominic Rizzo, gather enough evidence to bring him down, and uncover the truth behind the attempt on her father's life. Every emotion, every expression, every breath had been calculated, controlled, rehearsed. But now she was no longer certain what governed her choices. Dominic was not a name in a file. He was a person. The quiet moments with a glass of wine, the gaze that cut through every layer of her defenses, the man who fired 3 bullets to save her life and asked no questions afterward. He did not speak tender words, did not show softness, yet his presence alone shifted the ground beneath her feet. She remembered the even depth of his voice in the dark, the way he moved closer without making her feel afraid, yet that was exactly what frightened her more than any gun ever pointed at her. If she let her feelings take the lead, she could destroy everything. And if Dominic was only manipulating her with a calculated gentleness, then she had walked straight into the most intricate trap of all, one she had not even seen forming. She opened her laptop and logged into the encrypted system. A brief report awaited completion, a summary of unusual transactions in the last 48 hours. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, but her mind slipped away. Each time she typed Dominic's name, she paused for a heartbeat. Before, it had meant nothing. Now every line she wrote felt like it tightened around her chest. She could file the report, keep hiding her identity, smile at him as if nothing had changed, but she could not lie to herself that the way he touched her last night had been part of the plan. It had not been an act. She knew that more deeply than anything else. Mid-morning, Dominic stepped into the secondary office where she was working. He wore a white shirt without a tie, a folder in hand. His glance swept over her briefly, yet long enough to warm her cheeks. He set the file on the desk, his voice steady as always. "I need your analysis before 3. Maddie nodded, avoiding his eyes. Dominic turned to leave, then stopped. "Tonight. The backyard. 7 o'clock. Dinner. Not a question. Not an invitation. A decision." Maddie nodded again, slower this time, softer. When he walked away, she leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling. She had once believed she was strong enough to avoid being drawn into any personal entanglement during the mission, but Dominic was not like anyone she had ever encountered, and she, whether she admitted it or not, was no longer standing anywhere safe. She was stepping into a territory where a single wrong decision could ruin everything. Yet worse than exposure, worse than failure, was the realization that she was losing the boundary between loyalty and a feeling far too real to deny. That evening, dinner in the backyard unfolded beneath soft golden lights and the distant sound of waves brushing against the rocky shore. Dominic said little, simply sat across from Maddie with a glass of wine in hand, his gaze pausing on the corner of her mouth every so often, as though he were listening to something beyond the words she spoke. She asked nothing personal in return, keeping the conversation anchored to work, new investments, and the data sheets they had reviewed throughout the week. But after dinner, When Dominic stepped away to take an urgent call, Maddie returned to the secondary office where she had left her phone. On the desk lay the folder he had given her that morning, and beneath it was another, thicker file, with no name on the cover. Part curiosity, part instinct sharpened by years of training, she opened it, intending to skim only briefly until her eyes stopped on a familiar name listed in an old Target profile from 10 years ago. Walter Cross, her father's name. Her breath froze, her heart stalled. The file was a preserved copy extracted from the FBI's internal system. Beneath her father's name was the authorization of a termination plan staged as a residential gas explosion. The operative responsible was redacted, but below that was a signature Maddie recognized instantly. The senior supervisor of the very special intelligence unit she served. Maddie went rigid, her hands shaking. The floor beneath her seemed to give way. For years she had believed her father was being protected, but it had all been a lie. They hadn't protected him. They had tried to kill him. She gripped the edge of the desk, but as her eyes scanned the final page, her blood ran cold for a different reason. It was an addendum, not from the FBI file, but from Dominic's private intelligence system, cross-referenced with the date. It was dated 3 days after the authorized termination. It detailed an intervention at a federal safe house in Montana. Target, WC, secured and relocated. FBI channels confirmed target eliminated. Her breath stalled. The postcard from Montana. It wasn't from witness protection. It was after his rescue. The FBI believed they had killed him, but someone else had gotten to him first. Dominic. Dominic Rizzo had saved her father's life 6 years ago, and had been hiding him ever since. The man she was sent to destroy was the only reason her father was still alive. Pain surged through her chest, but it was no longer just grief, it was a devastating, impossible gratitude. In the chaos of grief and disillusionment, Maddie knew one thing with absolute certainty. Everything had changed. She was no longer just an agent. She was the daughter of a man betrayed, the keeper of a secret that could burn an entire system to the ground. And soon, very soon, she would have to decide whether to continue down the path she had been given, or begin rewriting the truth on her own terms. Dominic stood motionless in his third-floor office, the glow from the computer screen casting a cold, steel blue light across his face. The file Maddie had accidentally left slightly open revealed just enough of an internal FBI authentication code to tell him everything he needed to know. It took him less than 2 minutes to understand that this was no ordinary report, and he needed no further proof to recognize that she was not who he believed she was. Not Isabel Torre, not an anonymous administrative assistant, not the quiet woman who had walked into his estate with wide, innocent eyes and seemingly unwavering loyalty. She was an agent, a spy, and worse, she was the woman he had trusted enough to stand behind him in every private meeting. Dominic sank into the chair, fingers tightening around the armrest, his jaw hardening. Memories rushed in like a storm. The way she listened during her first assignment, the speed at which she absorbed information, the faint, unreadable smile she gave when he once mentioned his past. He should have recognized it earlier, but he had not wanted to. Or more truthfully, he had been unable to, because somewhere along the way, he had allowed himself to trust her. And now, the price was the sharp sting of betrayal, not from an employee, but from the only woman who had ever slipped past his defenses. Maddie was in the small workroom, head bowed over a new set of data files, burying herself in work to escape the brutal truth she had uncovered the night before about her father's death. She did not know when Dominic appeared in the doorway behind her, only lifted her head when he spoke, his voice low and rough like winter wind. Maddie. Her real name. Isabel was gone. Dominic tossed a small USB drive onto the table. Inside, it was the complete archive of her encrypted communications with headquarters. She didn't deny it, didn't try to explain it away. She simply looked at him, eyes wide and aching. Dominic did not yell, did not lash out, but the silence between them was heavier than any accusation. How long? His voice was so quiet it was nearly a breath. 6 months, she whispered. He nodded once, as though confirming a truth he had always sensed but still hoped to be wrong about. He turned away, hands in his pockets, moving toward the large window. Why? The question carried no bitterness, only a deep, cutting wound. Maddie rose and stepped closer. Because of my father. Because I once believed justice was the only path. I came here to expose you, to take you down. But I didn't expect. She faltered. Dominic faced her, his eyes darker, colder, and sadder than she had ever seen. You didn't have to betray me. I trusted you. Her lips trembled. Tears gathered, but she refused to let them fall. I never meant for it to go this far. I never thought I would feel anything. Dominic let out a faint sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite regret. Something in between, as though mourning what neither of them could undo. So what now? Will you go back and keep reporting? Or stay and wait for me to forgive you? She shook her head. I'm not going back. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need you to know. Everything I've done since that night in Red Hook was real. What I feel is real. Dominic studied her for a long time, searching her eyes for a shard of the trust he once placed in her, but finding only the truth that had come too late. He stepped back, creating a distance as though that space were the only thing keeping him steady. You should leave. Tonight. Before this goes beyond anything I can control. Maddie opened her mouth, wanting to speak, but no words came. She nodded instead. When she turned away, her steps felt impossibly heavy, as though she carried an entire life that had ended before it had ever truly begun. Dominic did not look after her. He stood still, staring out toward the sea where the waves crashed against the rocks, as if there had never been a kiss in the rain, never a trust undone, never two people on opposite sides who touched at the exact wrong moment only to lose everything because the truth never stays quiet. Maddie left the Montauk estate that very night, exactly as Dominic had told her to. The cold cut straight through her coat, the ocean wind striking her face in sharp, relentless waves. But none of it stung as deeply as the hollow ache spreading through her chest. She carried almost nothing with her, only a single bag and the encrypted phone that had gone dead the moment Dominic uncovered who she really was. The iron gate shut behind her with a heavy metallic thud, a sound that felt like the final punctuation mark on everything she once believed she might still salvage. She rented a small room near Jamaica Station, somewhere ordinary enough for no one to look twice. But not even an hour after she lay down, her backup phone vibrated violently. A familiar string of internal numbers flashed across the screen. There was no escaping it. She answered before she had time to brace herself. The supervisor's voice was cold as ice water, stripped of any trace of humanity. You made a mess, Cross. Maddie closed her eyes. I want out. I've been compromised. I'm no longer safe. A short, harsh laugh crackled through the speaker, filled not with humor but with contempt. You think you're allowed to walk away? You belong to us, Cross. You enter the game, you finish it. Maddie's grip tightened on the phone. I can't continue. Dominic knows I'm an agent. They'll kill me if I go back. The supervisor spoke slowly, each word landing like a stone against her ribs. No, they won't kill you, not until we say so. A chill slid down Maddie's spine. It wasn't reassurance. It was a threat. His voice deepened, colder still. Do you know what happens to an agent who fails? They aren't given vacation time. They disappear. Maddie clutched the edge of the thin mattress. He paused deliberately, as if savoring the way each syllable stripped away another layer of her resolve. And there's another reason you're going back. Her breath caught. You want to know how your father really died, don't you? Maddie froze. They knew. They knew she had seen the file. Maddie's grip tightened on the phone. I can't continue. Dominic knows I'm an agent. They'll kill me if I go back. The supervisor's voice was cold, unsurprised. We know, and you're still going back. Maddie froze. Why? He won't trust me. We don't need him to trust you. We need him to react to you. Dominic Rizzo is meeting Alberto Giancarlo in Hudson in 3 days. Your presence. It's a complication. It will force a move. Maddie went rigid. They weren't asking her to gather intel. They were using her as a catalyst. You want me to start a war? A cold laugh crackled through the speaker. We want the board cleared, Cross. Giancarlo thinks he's taking Dominic out. We're just ensuring the conditions are right. If you aren't there, Dominic might get suspicious and pull out. Go back. Make him think you're desperate. Your mission isn't to retrieve documents. Your mission is to be in that room when the shooting starts. When the call ended, Maddie sat motionless for a long time. They weren't sending her on a mission. They were sending her to her death, hoping she'd take Dominic down with her. The last sentence drove straight through her chest like a blade. When the call ended, Maddie sat motionless for a long time. Images collided painfully inside her mind. Her father's orchestrated death at the hands of the very system he served. Dominic's eyes filled with wordless disappointment as he walked away, the FBI's voice tightening around her like a noose. She wanted to run, to disappear from both sides, but there was no escape. The FBI would never let her live if she refused. Dominic would never allow her near again, unless she proved something larger than any apology. Maddie pressed her palms against her temples, forcing herself to breathe. She could trust no one. Not Dominic, not the FBI, not any institution, only herself. And the truth about her father's death, the only thing left with the power to determine her next step. When the clock struck 2 a.m, Maddie stood, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the dim, narrow room. She did not know how this game would end, or whether she could ever return to who she had been, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. If she wanted to survive and drag the truth into the light, she had to return to the place where everything had taken its irreversible turn. Montauk, Dominic, and the darkness waiting for her there. When Maddie returned to Montauk, the afternoon sky hung low and colorless, a washed-out gray that seemed to scatter a thin layer of ash across every rooftop and tree line along the road. She did not enter through the main gate as she once had. Instead, she slipped in through a narrow service tunnel at the back of the property, a passage once built as an emergency exit for clandestine meetings. Luca was not there. Dominic was nowhere in sight. The house felt unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath, bracing for something inevitable. She moved quickly down into the underground records room, where encrypted archives were stored temporarily before being transferred out. There, Maddie accessed the backup system, searching for the fragments Dominic had once mentioned needing to review. She needed a lead, anything that could point her toward the person who truly ordered her father's death. While filtering through audio logs tagged from the previous week, an unmarked file suddenly opened on its own. No title, no classification. A voice filled the room, deep, rough, unmistakably familiar. Alberto Giancarlo, the aging patriarch of one of the 3 major Mafia branches in the Northeast. He was speaking on the phone, though the other party was unclear, and yet the recording quality was sharp enough for every word to cut through her like ice. Dominic knows too much. If we don't act during next week's meeting, it will end everything we've built. We cannot let that boy control the board. It's time to put an end to it. Maddie froze. The meeting he referred to was the annual gathering of the regional kingpins, a tradition held at a secluded estate near Hudson, a place with no phone signal, no cameras, no exits, each man allowed only a single bodyguard, and no one permitted to carry weapons. It was an unwritten rule meant to preserve peace, now repurposed into the perfect death trap, a place where eliminating Dominic would leave no trace. She stepped back, forcing her breath to steady. There were only 3 days left, and Dominic had no idea he was walking directly into an execution. Maddie did not know whether the FBI was aware of the plot, but something in her gut told her they would not interfere. To them, if Dominic died, her mission would be considered complete. No need for documents, no need for trials, no need for anyone to learn that the very organization sworn to uphold justice had helped orchestrate Walter Cross's death. She climbed the stairs and hurried into the back courtyard, the light rain beginning to fall but barely registering against her skin. Only one thought pulsed through her with blinding clarity. She could not let Dominic die. Even if he had pushed her away, even if that last look he gave her carried disappointment sharp enough to cut, she could not stand by and let him be murdered by the very men he once believed were his allies. She recognized the expression of someone about to be betrayed. She had seen it in her father's eyes all those years ago. She would not let history repeat itself. Not again. Maddie sprinted toward the garage, where Dominic's old unregistered car still sat hidden beneath a tarp. She would reach Hudson before he did. She would find a way to stop him, or at the very least, she would be there when the truth unraveled. If she could not save him, she would not let him face the end alone, and if necessary, she would risk everything, her safety, her cover, her life, to rewrite the ending that others had already drafted for them. Because for the first time in her life, Maddie Cross understood that her mission was no longer about upholding the justice of a system that had long since rotted. It was about keeping alive the one man she was never supposed to love. Maddie drove through the thickening rain, the wind cutting in cold, punishing bursts through the wet treetops lining the forest road, but she did not slow down. The old black car skidded slightly across the gravel path leading out of Montauk, its tires grinding over the soaked ground as if time itself were urging her forward with every second. In her mind, only one goal remained: reaching Hudson before Dominic stepped into the meeting. She knew it was nearly impossible. Dominic was punctual to the minute. He would never be late to a gathering with the men he had once called allies, even though those same men were now prepared to strike at him the moment his back was turned. She had sent an emergency signal through an internal encrypted channel, but no one answered. The FBI would not come. They already knew about the plan to kill Dominic and had chosen silence. They no longer cared about the truth. They only wanted an ending. Maddie understood this more clearly than anyone. She carried no weapon. She had no legal authority. She no longer had support from any system of power. All she possessed was a reckless belief that she could change something, or at the very least prevent Dominic from dying without knowing who stood behind the betrayal. When the car reached the final stretch of road leading to the Hudson River estate, she turned off the headlights and veered into a hidden trail beneath the trees. It was an old smuggling route from the 1980s, now abandoned, broken by cracked concrete and drowned in wild overgrowth. She walked the rest of the way, pushing through branches, mud clinging to her shoes, her clothes soaked through, but she kept moving. Each step brought her closer, each heartbeat louder, as if her body understood she was entering the center of a trap no one could drag her out of if she made a single wrong move. As she neared the estate, she heard a car stop at the main gate. Dominic. She knew the sound instantly. The way he closed a car door, the rhythm of his footsteps on old wooden planks, the blanket of silence that followed, like the last exhale of someone stepping into a place from which there was no return. Maddie crouched low, slipped beneath a broken section of the wooden fence, and followed the narrow outdoor corridor leading toward the back of the estate. Dim lights glowed through the frosted glass of the main meeting room. She saw Dominic's silhouette standing at the center, facing three men, one of them Alberto Giancarlo. They were speaking calmly, pretending at old camaraderie, but Alberto's hand rested atop a leather briefcase, and Maddie knew the case did not hold documents. It held a gun. Dominic still did not know. She pulled a small phone from her pocket, the only device still capable of connecting to the emergency frequency, and raised the volume just enough for one person to hear. She wanted to call his name, to warn him outright, but she could not. If she stormed the room, they would shoot both of them. If she hesitated, Dominic would die. There was no choice left. Maddie tightened her grip around the phone, counted to 3, and pushed open the side door of the estate. The door cracked loudly through the quiet like a breaking bone. All 4 men turned. Dominic froze when he saw her, his expression shifting from surprise to alertness in an instant. Maddie ran forward, placing herself between him and the others, her voice trembling. "Don't trust them. It's a trap. They plan to kill you." Dominic did not ask how she knew. He did not ask why she had come back. His eyes fixed on her face, rain-soaked and frantic. Then he turned to Alberto, his voice low and lethal. "Is it true?" No one answered. And in that brief, airless silence, Dominic understood everything. Maddie felt his hand close around hers, gripping hard. She no longer knew what would come next. She only knew she had chosen the right thing. She had not left him behind. And if the price for that was her own life, then at least her heart had not betrayed the one man who had managed to break through every layer of her armor to reach the part of her she had thought long gone. A split second after Maddie's warning, the air inside the room seemed to freeze. Dominic remained behind her, his gaze sweeping across the 3 faces in front of them, every sense within him sharpened to its highest edge. Alberto Giancarlo lifted one eyebrow and exhaled slowly, as if someone had interrupted a private indulgence. A single aged finger pressed lightly against the top of his briefcase, and that alone was the signal. The door behind Maddie flew open. 2 men in black stepped inside, guns raised and ready. Dominic pulled Maddie behind him in the span of a single breath. Everything that followed happened too quickly for thought to keep up. A gunshot exploded through the room. Then another. Dominic had not come here unprepared. He never did. He drew the Glock from beneath his coat, the first bullet tearing into the shoulder of the guard on the left, sending him collapsing backward. The second guard had barely tightened his finger around the trigger when Maddie lunged forward and kicked hard into his side, sending his shot angling harmlessly into the ceiling. Dominic never paused. He turned, fired again, and the bullet buried itself in the man's knee, his scream splitting the thick tension. Alberto jumped to his feet, reaching for the gun at his waistband, but age had slowed his hand. Dominic did not hesitate. His shot struck the man's wrist, sending the Beretta skidding across the polished floor. The room had become a storm of shouts, gunfire, ragged breathing, and the harsh scent of gunpowder curling through the air. One of the remaining old men tried to bolt, shoving his chair aside, But Luca appeared in the doorway at that very moment, his gun leveled between the man's eyes. No one knew how long Dominic had been preparing for this or when he had called his men, but Luca had not come alone. 3 others from Dominic's inner circle filed in behind him, fanning out across the room as though they had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Dominic raised a hand. Everything stopped. The room fell into a stark silence, broken only by the ragged rhythm of terrified breaths. He walked toward Alberto, bent down, retrieved the fallen gun, and tossed it onto the table with the finality of a gavel marking the end of an era. His voice was low but rang with a clarity that filled the room. You planned to kill me, but you forgot that the old blood no longer rules the new. Your systems, your corridors of influence, your alliances, they have all been dead for a long time. Maddie stood behind him, her eyes fixed on him, watching the steady strength in every step he took, every word he spoke. He was not shaking, not torn. He moved like a man who had written this scene long before his enemies ever imagined betraying him. Dominic locked his gaze on Alberto, whose arrogance had drained away entirely. What stood before him now was only an old man left behind by a world that had already moved on. You think I did not know you fed information to the FBI? You think I did not see the twisted payment trails in your off-the-books accounts? You think I did not understand that Walter Cross's death was nothing more than a cleanup job? Maddie's breath stalled. Dominic knew. He knew about her father. He knew the truth buried beneath years of lies, and yet he had never spoken of it. And now he was exposing everything in front of the very men responsible, as if laying the truth bare was its own form of justice. Dominic turned to the others. From this moment on, the old structure has no worth. If you still claim loyalty to him, walk out now. Otherwise, I will consider you enemies. No one moved. After a long, trembling silence, one middle-aged man quietly removed the insignia from his cuff and placed it on the table. The others followed. Only Alberto remained, blood dripping steadily from his wounded hand. Dominic looked at him one last time. This is your end. Not because of age, but because you no longer know how to fear the truth. He signaled. Luca stepped forward, ordering Alberto and the 2 remaining conspirators to be taken away and isolated for later judgment. When the room had emptied, leaving only Maddie and Dominic behind, he turned to her. His eyes no longer held steel, only exhaustion. You knew, didn't you? He asked. Maddie nodded. About my father. About everything. Dominic returned the nod. I kept it from you, because I thought you did not need another reason to hate me. Maddie stepped forward, gently taking his hand. I do not need any reason anymore. I just need you alive. Dominic tightened his grip for a brief moment, then let go and stepped away, heading toward the doorway. He still had work to finish, but in that fleeting second, standing in the ruins of loyalty and old empires, Maddie understood something with absolute clarity. Dominic had won. Not only the silent coup against the old Mafia order, but something far more dangerous. He had won her heart. Dawn had only just begun to break when Maddie and Dominic left the Hudson estate. The air after the shootout felt tightened like a drawn wire. Even though Dominic had regained control of the situation, he knew it was far from over. Power reclaimed was a double-edged blade, and a single misstep could send everything crashing down. Maddie walked beside him in silence, but Dominic could feel every quickened breath she took. Her eyes still carried the exhaustion of what they had endured, yet there was no fear in them. She had stayed. She had saved him. To Dominic, that meant more than loyalty itself. As they crossed the back courtyard toward the waiting car, a bullet sliced through the early morning air and struck the water barrel behind them. Dominic shoved Maddie to the ground and rolled toward the side of the car. A barrage of gunfire erupted from the tree line. A group of unknown attackers had launched an ambush at the final moment. Dominic drew his gun and fired back, eyes scanning desperately for Maddie. She lay a few feet away, her hand pressed to her abdomen, blood blooming across the white shirt already streaked with mud. Dominic roared her name and sprinted toward her, ignoring the bullets whipping past his head. He dragged her behind a thick tree trunk and pressed his hand over the wound. A bullet had torn through her right side, and the bleeding would not stop. Maddie clenched her teeth, gripping his arm. Don't let me die here. Dominic held her hand tightly, his voice a low burn. You won't die. I swear it. Luca and 2 guards reacted swiftly, eliminating the attackers within minutes. Dominic did not wait to learn who had sent them. The only thing that mattered was Maddie. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the car, laying her on her side in the back seat. pressing his coat firmly against the wound before climbing into the driver's seat. The car sped into the pale morning fog, its tires screaming over the asphalt. Dominic drove west, avoiding every major road, choosing instead narrow forest paths before merging onto a deserted stretch of highway. Each time Maddie groaned in pain, something in his chest tightened. She had saved his life. Now it was his turn to keep hers. More than 3 hours later, they arrived at a small wooden cabin buried deep within the Catskills, a place Dominic had used as a shelter in the early years of building his empire. He carried Maddie inside, placing her gently on the bed, before calling his private doctor through a secure, encrypted channel. The doctor arrived 2 hours later with medical equipment and painkillers. Maddie's wound, though serious, was not life-threatening, but she would need complete rest and several weeks of recovery. Dominic stayed by her side through the first days, refusing to let anyone but Luca near the cabin. He cooked for her, changed her bandages, and wiped her skin with quiet, unhurried hands. Each night, when she slept, he sat silently by the window, staring out at the forest, his mind tangled with thoughts he had no words for. Maddie opened her eyes on the 4th day and found his gaze already waiting for hers. In that moment, words felt unnecessary. She knew he had taken her far from everything. She knew, even before he spoke, that Dominic Rizzo had abandoned power and every plan for the coup still unfinished, choosing instead to remain here with her in this fragile space between life and death. "I'm sorry," Maddie whispered, her voice faint but steady. Dominic lowered himself, brushing his hand against her cheek. "No, I'm the one who's sorry. I doubted you. I didn't see you for who you truly were until you stepped in front of a gun for me." Maddie curled her fingers around his, her scraped knuckles fitting against his palm, and she offered a fragile smile. "So, we're fugitives now." Dominic nodded, and his eyes held not sorrow, but something like release. "If the choice is between power and your life, I don't hesitate. I already made my choice, and I don't regret it." Maddie looked at him for a long moment before closing her eyes. For the first time in many months, she drifted into sleep without dreams of pursuit, gunfire, or cold FBI badges. There was only Dominic, and the warmth of his hands, like a promise of another world waiting for them on the far side of the darkness they had both survived. Spring in Colorado carried with it a strange kind of peace, the kind that settled softly over the snowmelt, dripping in thin silver lines down the mountainsides and into the deep green valleys, sunlight filtering through the tall pines and falling gently on the small wooden cabin tucked beside a glassy lake. Maddie woke each morning to the quiet sounds of nature, with no blaring car horns, no radios echoing bad news, no classified files stamped in red waiting on her desk. It had been 6 months since the night Dominic carried her out of Hudson, 6 months without gunfire, without coded transmissions, without a single phone call from the FBI or anyone from the world she had left behind. At first, the silence unnerved her, as if every moment of calm were only a trick before the next storm. But slowly, Maddie learned that not all silence was dangerous. Sometimes, it was the beginning of a new kind of life. Dominic cut his hair shorter, abandoned the expensive suits, and wore soft flannel shirts and faded jeans. He drove a pickup truck, hauled lumber for the locals, learned to split wood, repair old water pumps, and live as an ordinary man. Maddie opened a small yoga class in the nearby town, hiding behind the new name she and Dominic had chosen during a quiet night camping beneath the stars. She taught older adults, pregnant women, anxious children. No one asked too many questions. In Colorado, people rarely cared about the past if someone's present life was decent enough. They lived in a wooden cabin rented from an elderly couple who had moved to Florida. The house was not large, but it was warm, with a wood stove that glowed red in the evenings, and a porch wide enough for them to sit together and watch the sun settle behind the mountains. Dominic spent most of his days outdoors, but each time he returned home, he brought Maddie something small, a wildflower, a heart-shaped stone, or a story about an owl he had seen at dawn. Maddie cooked, wrote down everything she had lived through in a thick leather notebook, as if she were slowly cleansing each layer of memory. They did not speak often about their pasts, but sometimes, on nights when the moon hung low and soft across the lake, when they lay in quiet beside each other, Dominic would tell her about his parents, about the first time he learned to set traps from an uncle who lived outside the law, about what it felt like the first time he took a life, not to justify himself, only so she would know. And Maddie listened, without judgment. She told him about her years inside the FBI's webs of deception, about the loneliness of carrying two faces at once, and about the dream she had abandoned long ago to become a literature teacher at a small high school in Vermont. Dominic told her that perhaps she still would. When everything was over, Maddie smiled. She had never dared imagine that far ahead. Once, when snow fell late in April, Dominic took her hand and led her onto the porch, pointing toward the sky. The world was white and quiet, and he told her that sometimes a person did not need to answer every question life asked, so long as the one beside them was still there when the snowfall passed. Maddie tightened her fingers around his and rested her head against his shoulder. She did not know what their future would look like, whether the FBI would return, whether the world they had escaped would someday crash through their fragile peace. But she knew that in this moment, in a little cabin deep within the Colorado mountains, she had chosen to live, and Dominic had chosen the same. Two souls, once caught in the violent storms of power and deception, were now simply a man and a woman learning to live again from the ashes. And with each passing day, they believed a little more that perhaps this time, they might keep the one thing they once lost, not justice, but each other. Dominic stood by the window, looking out over the valley where the melting snow shimmered like thousands of broken mirrors beneath the morning sun. 6 months in Colorado had taught him many things, and the most important was that silence did not mean surrender. It was simply the distance a man needed to take before rebuilding his life, not for power, not for blood, but for a version of himself who could someday look into a mirror without feeling ashamed. The wounds in Maddie had begun to heal, not just the physical ones but the fractures in trust and the dreams she had once buried. They did not speak about returning to their old world, but they both understood that Dominic could not live in the mountains forever, and that day arrived sooner than either of them expected. Someone from Dominic's past, an anonymous investor who had once laundered money for his operations, reached out through an old encrypted channel, not to force him back, but to offer him something unexpected, a chance to make everything legitimate. Dominic refused at first, knowing well that the old world rarely released those who walked away from it, but Maddie urged him to reconsider. She told him that if he wanted to live beyond the reach of the FBI or any other system, he could not hide forever. He needed to build a life they could not dismantle, and the only way was to turn darkness into light. Dominic began by connecting with a small startup in Denver that specialized in information security, a place where former analysts from the NSA and CIA had gathered after retirement. He invested quietly, using the alias he and Maddie had created during their first weeks in Colorado. The capital came from funds he had already cleaned, most of it from assets he had frozen before withdrawing from the underworld. Then he purchased a failing software company, restructuring the entire leadership team and replacing it with young visionaries who had no idea who he had once been. Dominic never appeared in the press, never signed his real name on legal documents, but every strategy, every investment round, every negotiation carried the unmistakable precision of a man who had survived years of living on a knife's edge. Over the next 6 months, the company grew rapidly in the field of cybersecurity and personal data protection, securing pilot contracts with 2 states and a national bank. Dominic did not use the success to rebuild his throne. He used it to sever himself from the old empire. He handed control of the remaining branches to those more deserving, men without blood debts, men untouched by his former life. He had his people erase the entire blackmail archive he once held over politicians, while quietly passing along a few crucial files to independent attorneys to ensure the most ruthless figures would never return to power. Maddie watched all of it in quiet understanding, knowing Dominic was walking a path that demanded more strength than violence ever had. One evening, she asked if he ever regretted giving everything up just to begin again. Dominic did not answer immediately. He simply looked at her for a long time before saying that without her, he would never have known what beginning again even meant. Maddie touched his hand lightly. She told him she did not need him to be perfect, only to choose the right side. Dominic had already made that choice, and now, his empire was no longer made of smoke-filled rooms, veiled handshakes, or back-alley transactions. It was clean numbers, lines of code written by young minds, a kind of power no one could take by force. One night, as they sat on the porch with the scent of pine drifting in the wind, Maddie rested her head on his shoulder and quietly asked what he would say if someone someday asked who he used to be. Dominic smiled, not looking at her, only gazing toward the mountains sinking into the dusk. He said he would tell them that he once lost everything just to learn that real power was never in the fear he could command, but in the peace he could give to the person he loved. Maddie said nothing more, because she knew, from that moment on, there was nothing left to fear. The wedding took place on a clear autumn afternoon, far from the noise of the city, without lavish backdrops or crowds of guests. Only a small stretch of grass at the foot of a hill, a few rows of simple wooden chairs, jars of wildflowers arranged by hand, and people who were there out of love rather than obligation. Maddie walked between trees, turning gold and amber, her simple white dress free of lace and ornament, her hair falling softly down her back, her hands trembling as she held a bouquet of lavender she had picked that morning. Dominic waited at the end of the path in a white shirt and charcoal trousers, no tie, no formal suit. Yet his gaze had never been gentler. When Maddie drew near, Dominic reached out his hand without a word, and in that quiet touch was a vow deeper than anything they could have spoken aloud. Their witness was Luca, the man who had once killed without hesitation, now wearing a small boutonniere and standing stiffly like a father giving his daughter away. Maddie smiled softly when she saw Luca awkwardly holding the marriage license, his eyes suspiciously wet even as he tried to maintain a stern face. The officiant was an elderly pastor from a neighboring town, a man who knew nothing of their pasts, only that he was blessing two souls who had traveled far and suffered much to finally find each other. When Dominic slid the ring onto Maddie's finger, she felt her heart settle like a still lake after a storm. No more torment, no more doubt, only a peace so profound it felt like an embrace she had waited her whole life to receive. After the ceremony, as the guests drifted away and the candles on the small reception table burned down to faint flickers, Maddie quietly walked toward the wooden cabin behind the garden. She knew someone would be waiting. He stepped from the shadows as if he had never been gone, his hair more silver than before, his eyes deep yet warmer than she remembered. Walter Cross was still alive. He had not died in the accident the FBI claimed had taken him. He had been placed in the witness protection program after agreeing to expose part of the leak network, but once he learned his daughter had been pushed into the game as a disposable pawn, he broke protocol and contacted Dominic to find a way to get Maddie out. Dominic had kept that secret from the beginning, because he knew that if Maddie had found out too soon, she would have been overwhelmed by emotion and unable to finish what she needed to do. Maddie did not get angry, nor did she speak. She simply threw her arms around her father, holding him as if every wound she had ever carried softened beneath that embrace. Walter held her back, trembling from too many years spent in the dark without seeing her grow. "You have done what neither I nor your mother ever thought possible. You lived, and you kept your heart intact," Walter whispered into her hair. Maddie said nothing, her tears soaking into his shoulder. It was a moment that needed no witnesses. Dominic stood behind them in silence, watching father and daughter reunite, his hand tightening at his side as if to carve this sight into memory forever. That night, there was no celebration, no champagne or fireworks. They sat together around the wood stove, eating warm apple pie, sipping tea, and sharing stories that no one needed to hide anymore. For the first time in many years, none of them feared what the next day might bring. They had walked through the darkest roads, had faced the most brutal choices, and now they could finally say they had survived. Not perfectly, but honestly. As the night drifted on, Maddie rested her head on Dominic's shoulder, eyes closed, her fingers intertwined with his, and in that quiet moment, she knew the old chapter had closed. There would be no more hiding, no more running, no more being a spy or a hunter. Only her, the man she loved, and the father she thought she had lost. At last, they were home. The following spring, on a clear morning when cherry blossoms bloomed in soft clusters around the porch of the little wooden house, the cry of a newborn broke the silence like the turning of a fresh page in Maddie and Dominic's lives. They named the baby Ethan Walter Rizzo, carrying with him two immense legacies, one shaped by an imperfect past and the other filled with a future still unwritten. Dominic held his son in his arms, his eyes softened in a way Maddie had never witnessed before, as if every scar, every mistake, every loss he had ever endured found its quiet healing in the moment tiny Ethan curled his warm fingers around his father's. Maddie watched the two men in her life, the weight in her chest lifting until it felt as light as clouds. Everything they had once run from, everything they had sacrificed, everything that had hurt them had somehow led them to this place where life began again. But even as Colorado remained peaceful, she knew some shadows had not entirely faded. An anonymous letter arrived in their mailbox, with no address and no signature. It contained only one short line: "Enjoy the time you have left." Maddie did not need to look at Dominic to know his gaze had darkened. She did not need to ask who he believed had sent it. Both of them understood that the old FBI, the ones who had used her as a tool, had not withdrawn. They knew Dominic was alive. They knew the truth about Walter's death had been exposed, and perhaps they were ready to silence anyone who carried that truth. But unlike before, Maddie no longer felt fear. She was no longer an agent living between two worlds. Dominic was no longer a power broker hiding in the shadows. They were a family, and families fought for one another. They strengthened their home security, added layers of encrypted communication, but they did not run. Dominic continued running his technology company from a distance, now with offices in 3 major cities. Maddie began writing, and her first book was the story of her own journey told through the shape of a novel. No real names, no specific places, but the emotions were so vivid that readers could not help but feel them. She did not write to expose the past, but to remind anyone out there feeling lost that there is always a path back to themselves. In the end, this was not only a story about Dominic and Maddie, it was a story about choosing, about forgiving oneself, about daring to let go of power in order to choose a life grounded in peace. And above all, it was a story reminding us that love, when it is strong enough, can change a person, and sometimes even their destiny. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video so its emotions can reach even more people. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel to stay with us in the next videos, where we will continue to bring you stories filled with humanity, tenderness, and reflections that may mirror pieces of your own life. How did you feel after hearing Maddie and Dominic's journey? Have you ever found yourself torn between reason and the heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because we are always grateful to hear the truest feelings from deep inside your hearts. Thank you for spending your time with this story. We wish you good health, days filled with joy, peace, and the strength to find light even in the darkest moments. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.